Good afternoon, everyone. We return to our discussions of Eugene Borowitz and his work, consummate work reviewing the Covenant, which we have talked about now over the course of at least 2 discs, if not 2 sessions, which we have not done. The subtitle, you'll recall, is A Theology for the Postmodern Jew. Where we left off was discussing the issue of the distinction between immanence and transcendence in his thinking, Borowitz's thinking. And the main thing to keep in mind at this point as we begin to take off from here and move further along in his discussion is that the more immanent God is, the less suited he is to be in a position to command. That's assuming one wants to use personalistic language. I realize the gender issue may lead us to choose either feminine language or neutral language, or names only like Adonai and the like. But the issue here is both the personality of God, and that will be dealt with shortly, and transcendence gives a standing and an authority to God that is not available from God simply being one, another, or a totality of manifestations that we find but do not always recognize as divine, that are immanent within the world. There might be meaningful moments and epiphanies and so on and so forth, but that does not give them any special authority to guide us in life. But if God represents something higher than we are, higher than we often conceive of things, then that is a basis for offering A, instruction, and B, commandment, both of which are obviously embodied in Torah. Now, moving along with his discussion of transcendence, I just wanted to focus on a number of observations he makes. One in particular that stands out, and this is to be found on page 100 of our text. The chapter title is Reaching for Transcendence, and there are 2 paragraphs that I'd like to call attention to here. First, the one before the subheading, What do we mean by transcendence? And it begins here. Actually, it begins just before that. The ground of value we intuit has sufficient beyondness to authorize values, yet allows sufficient otherness in persons, all persons, regardless of sex, to accord them all unalienable dignity. In other words, God's presence in beyondness gives God, as it were, the authority to command, to instruct, to guide, from a broader view, a higher view, a more comprehensive view. And secondly, God is immanent enough. It's not that God has to be only and totally transcendent, but God is immanent enough that it allows sufficient otherness in persons, all persons regardless of sex, to accord them unalienable dignity. So we can generalize, and this is where I had called your attention to the paragraph. Thinkers who deny transcendence, transposing hierarchy into the breadth of the plane on which we function, that is to say, bringing all hierarchy and dissolving it into the horizontal realm within which we live our lives. Let's call it the realm of human affairs, okay? Doing that gives us no compelling basis for choosing among nature's plethora of possibilities. In other words, why prefer one rather than the other? Why be guided by one rather than the other? Why consider ourselves commanded if we do it all? By some phenomenon, some person, some complex of ideas that are part of our natural activity, why would we give this the authority to legislate for us or command us? So he goes on. We can see this issue in Hermann Cohen's unrelenting polemic against the pre-naturalist thought of Baruch Spinoza, whose virtual identification of nature and God produced an ethics that does not seek to transform the world, but to adjust one's intellect to it. All who hold Messianism dear must reject such refusal to act against the world's evils. In other words, he's reading Spinoza as being an accommodationist. One of the things he seems to be either unaware of or neglect to refer to is that Spinoza was also, amongst being the first perhaps secular Jew, he was a protesting Jew. When Jan de Witt, a Republican political leader within the Dutch Republic, was assassinated, Spinoza deliberately went out with a placard and marched up and down in a public area with the words Ultimi Barbarorum. That's Latin, typically him, but nonetheless it means lowest or ultimate barbarians are the ones who are responsible for this. Public protest, not necessarily accommodation to whatever happens in the natural world, but that will be a footnote to the comment. Now then, when he turns to the new rubric, what do we mean by transcendence? And he means here himself and those who agree with him. He answers as follows. I can identify three significant characteristics of transcendence that make it an attractive theological metaphor. That he chooses to refer to this as a metaphor is a little surprising, because I think he takes it more seriously than just being a literary trope. But let's see at least what he concentrates on. First, our religious experience teaches us that another dimension of reality intersects with that of our customary existence. It manifests itself in a distinctive beyondness. We sense it, and I want to repeat this, we sense it. Its complete independence of us, though we mysteriously have a most intimate consciousness of its reality and presence, one that allows us to recognize an ennobling sameness between it and our most essential being. So he is suggesting that we have actually a direct awareness of God's being beyond us. Though he didn't use the word presence, it would seem to be that that is presupposed. We sense its independence of us. It has a distinct nature or personality. He doesn't mention personality here, but I will be taking it up shortly, so it does actually figure into his explicit theological teaching. And here now we have the word presence. We sense its complete independence of us, though we mysteriously have a most intimate consciousness of its reality and presence. And what's unique about it is that it creates an ennobling sameness between it and our most essential being. By sameness, he means not some bland abstraction. He means a connection by which what is characteristic of God in an exalted way, in a transcendent way, has a counterpart in us that is essentially the same, and which raises us up if we have not reached our full stature, and gives us guidance, direction, that we are by nature, and presumably by both morality and rationality, inclined to accept and recognize as truly of worth, truly guiding in the best sense of the word, and therefore to be adhered to, listened to, responded to. Now, he goes on, after mentioning this, our religious experience. This is the first thing that comes with what we mean by transcendence, a certain kind of experience of God, if you will, on a level higher than our own, and yet reaching out to us, or at least in some kind of connection with us, that addresses us in a way that we recognize similarity or sameness in terms of what distinguishes God and what distinguishes us in some respect. More needs to be said. So he goes on the next page and says this about transcendence. Second, the otherness of the transcendent confronts us not only with rightful authority, but with exalted quality as well. Much of what we have recognized as most worthwhile in ourselves, we discover raised to a superlative level in the transcendent. The transcendent here is capitalized with a capital T, so that it becomes essentially an epithet for God. In other words, you can use each word, God or the transcendent, synonymously. What remains fragmentary, conflicted, and unrealized in us, we intuit has complete integration in its oneness. So it is not simply that God has rightful authority in being beyond us, but we recognize that there is something superlative, an achievement, something of immense worth in what the divine represents for us. It is not ordinary. It is certainly not profane. It is not in itself conflicted or understood to be fragmentary. God is somehow a whole, and a whole that is not divided within itself, at war within itself, some kind of tension within reality that is trying to work itself out into a unity. That's not the way he conceives of God. There is an integration that corresponds to oneness. This is anticipated, of course, within the medieval tradition, which identifies God with having no parts conceptually or in any other way, and therefore God cannot be divided, fragmented, also cannot be defined, analyzed in any respects. Therefore, we can never expect to get to the essence of God and truly to understand it. So that is the second element, and he adds to this, though this qualitative aspect of transcendence also exceeds our ability to plumb or to articulate it, it lures us via our qualitative likeness to realize our humanhood more fully by seeking to emulate its character. It lures us by its qualitative character to try and imitate and become like, to resemble its qualitative character. To put it in perhaps more colloquial language, its interior unity and lack of conflict draws us to wish to achieve the same thing. And we have many interior conflicts, some recognized, some not recognized, that we try and work out in our behavior, in our thinking, and the way we feel about things. And many times these kinds of conflicts can be resolved. It's an achievement, to say the least. But it's not always natural to us by any means. But it is regarded as natural to God. This thought is captured actually in a beautiful aspect of the Midrash on Shir HaShirim, in which the reference to HaMelech Shlomo, Solomon, who is the alleged by tradition author of the work, is HaMelech Shehashalom Shelo. That is to say, he is the king who has within him, or who has possession of, but not as a trinket or a fortune of coins, but as part of himself. Shalom, wholeness. Wholeness is one aspect. The absence of conflict, battle, war, and all that goes with it. So that is something indeed worthy of love, and if the Song of Songs represents the allegory generally understood by tradition, then God, the lover, who is the king who has peace within himself, loves Israel and wishes Israel to have the same experience, the same phenomenon within itself. certainly a solution to lots of the conflicts that are repeated again and again and described in detail in Genesis. You remember the sibling rivalries and what happened with Joseph and his brothers, among other things. Okay, so much on the matter of what is entailed by transcendence. There is one other point that he makes. I finished number 2. Let me briefly mention the third, and then we will go on. This is on 102. Third, brought together, the foregoing elements of transcendence indicate why it properly sets the standards for our existence in more personalistic language, why it rightly commands us. Skipping down just a little further along the page, because we find it manifesting supreme quality, we cannot be satisfied with the relativism that pure immanence would impose upon us if God were only immanent in the world. Its superlative quality also gives us the confidence that despite our limited ability to specify its nature or its exact entailments, as the orthodoxies allegedly can do, we gain from exposure to it the criterion of rightful exercise of our freedom. And then finally, should we then defy the standards it enjoins on us? We do so at the cost of rejecting the source of our own unimpeachable dignity, and thus our very own worth. In other words, when we have attained that shalom, where all that should be in place, working harmoniously within us, personality traits, strengths, rational fears, aspirations, when all of that is in harmony and functions with shalom, that is the source of our integrity, which makes us one and unified. And that is the basis of our worth. So that covers the implications of transcendence, I hope with reasonable clarity. We turn now to the issue of God's being a personal God. There are many personalistic symbolizations that are discussed within the book, and they, in many respects, represent the equivalent for him of metaphors or invocations of that rabbinic phrase that you are familiar with, kaviyachol. If it could be said, then it would be said this way, and in language that is obviously very personalistic and in some ways even quite intimate. The ultimate criterion for Borowitz is that which gives vitality to the life of Torah. It results in a life of Torah, but a life of Torah is not necessarily identical with halakha. What has this got to do with person-likeness as a characteristic of God, or personality, if one wants to be even more, how shall one characterize it, definite and colloquial regarding it? Well, let me direct your attention to 2 passages which he takes up. The first gives you a clear sense of where he leans, and the second explicates it a bit further, and then directs us to consider a variety of thinkers who reason along somewhat similar lines, but with variations that he does not necessarily endorse. So under the rubric, the Varieties of the Transcendent, this is on page 103, he says the following. I'm on paragraph 2 of page 103. Thus far, I have limited this discussion of the idea of transcendence to rationalistic, impersonal models. In principle, as long as a conception of the transcendent vitalizes, that means gives vitality to, the life of Torah, I believe Judaism open to either impersonal or personal understandings of it. We're talking about conceptions of God as transcendent. I myself, now here he speaks for himself, and he does what is very characteristic of his theology throughout. He's going to build what he wants to say on what he himself sees out of personal experience and reflection on themes discussed by others. I myself have found that a personalistic version of the notion of divine transcendence conveys a fuller metaphoric sense of the reality, the religious reality, that I know, and also shows greater continuity with the images utilized by our prophets and sages. Now, he still calls personalistic language metaphorical, so we don't know for sure from here just how committed he is to personalistic language. Other than that, it's generally more coherent with experiences he has had. He doesn't go into detail about the experiences. Occasionally he does, but more often than not he alludes to experiences only. He's certainly clear when he invokes the language used by the prophets. They refer to God just about consistently in personalistic languages or personalistic metaphors. So one can see that perhaps for practical reasons he has a preference for personalistic references and metaphors as we speak about transcendence, and also because of some unidentified aspects of his own experience. You can read on further for what he has to say about Milton Steinberg, one of the figures he wants to discuss, because he is similar in this regard to Borowitz. He also, of course, talks about Buber, because Buber, you will recall, says of the infinite number of attributes he associates with God. And he does this in the epilogue of I Am Now, when he makes an explicit comparison between his conception of the eternal thou that cannot become an it and Spinoza's conception of Deus sive natura, God or nature. He said Spinoza said that there were two attributes out of the infinite number God actually has that we human beings, are able to know. One is thought, and the other is extension. Thought has to do with intelligence and intelligibility, and extension has to do with being evident or found within space, manifest in some way within three-dimensional space. Those are two dimensions, that is to say, two dimensions, two attributes, thought and I just lost the word, extension, that was the word. What's the third that Buber suggests that Spinoza leaves out, but he thinks would be applicable when he speaks of the eternal thou who cannot become an it? And he says it is person-likeness. Okay? So in speaking about Buber's views on the subject, he invokes Buber because, again, there is an affinity between what he experiences and what he has a leaning towards, and other thinkers that are of interest to him, even though he doesn't agree with Buber on all points. But he goes on later in the chapter. Specifically, I want to direct you to page 128 to readdress the issue. And he says this, the following. Perhaps the root religious perception of the non-rationalists can be put this way. This is in the first paragraph of page 128. That we do not, cannot know a lot about God is a constant accompaniment of the wonder of knowing even this much about God, particularly about what God wants us to do. Okay? But now he adds the following. Beyond this stance, the theological positions diversify. Some thinkers perceive God to be impersonal. I rather know God in personal encounter, and then curiously discover that my rationality confirms this, namely the person-likeness of God in the encounter. My rationality confirms this by balking at the incoherence of persons being created in the image of an impersonal God. Let me repeat that just so that it will be clear. He balks at the notion, obviously supported by non-rationalistic theologians, whereby persons could be created in the image of an impersonal God. Some non-rationalists find the problem of evil to disclose God's finitude. I find the assertion to generate such serious problems, in other words, the notion of a finite God, that I normally live in acceptance of the mystery of God's good nature somehow allows for evil. So evil for him is a mystery. But what is becoming increasingly clear is that it is not just a matter of pragmatism or familiarity with terms in the religious literature of our people, that he has a preference for speaking in personalistic terms about God. But this comes right out of his experience, and it comes out of it in a deep way, not in a superficial way, perhaps associated with common ways of speaking of God, simply because of religious languages where you recognize it with the prayer book or other kinds of references. So I think that is probably enough to at least vindicate the notion of God as person-like for Borowitz, and not impersonal in any meaningful sense. There are further references to his views on God and the problem of evil, which obviously comes up if God is endowed with power at all and is not finite. And remember, he rejects the notion of a finite God. Then he's going to have to face the problem of evil. Here he wonders about it because it's a mystery or a secret. I want to refer you on your own to check out pages 150 and 168 and 69 that deals with the issue of theodicy and develops a bit further the brief remarks that he makes here. I'm not going to go into that in detail now, but I think you have enough to build upon and see at least how he develops his thinking. Now, what does he have to say about creation? What does he have to say about the people Israel as something God has created, and what it itself creates? We'll talk a little bit further about Torah, and we'll see how far we can come towards the end of the discussion in the book having to do with the closing chapters that I alluded to at the end of the last session. I'm going to take a brief break now and continue very quickly. Now, continuing with his discussion of the basic categories of Judaism. If we ask the question, what constitute the basic categories of Judaism for him, the answer that he proposes would be, and in fact is, in principle, creation, revelation, and redemption. Borowitz claims to be in complete continuity with the traditional conception of revelation. That is to say, God is revealed to, or reveals himself to, the people Israel and individual selves, each having some impact upon the other, the self upon the group upon the individual self. Think of Moses, think of any successor to Moses, etc. And likewise, in the experience of revelation, there can be a back and forth. It is not simply a one-way peroration on God's part, although there may be a lot that God puts forward, as he puts it, but it will always be put forward in words that human beings are ultimately the source of. He is not suggesting, to the best of my knowledge, that God engages in verbal revelation of the kind that was insisted upon by the Orthodox, both traditional, modern, and certainly ultra-Orthodox today, in terms of how God communicates. What about creation? What would his attitude be to the traditional notion of creation? He is basically, as he suggests, piously agnostic with regard to it, which is to say that, in effect, he must leave it to others to determine how the world as we understand it originated, and under what circumstances. You can find some reference to this in two places that will be of some interest. Page 138, and then later 140. Let's see what he says briefly on 138. Since I believe, top paragraph, since I believe that the normative function of the doctrine of creation, namely establishing God's right to command, can be established more convincingly by the experience of transcendence, I join in the pious contemporary agnosticism about what it means to say that God created. He doesn't withdraw the legitimacy of language that characterizes God as the creator, or statements that say God created X, Y, and Z, us in God's image, or the creatures of the deep, those that are dwelling on the land and those that fly above the land. But he, as he has put it now, is agnostic with regard to the content, the method, and the process, although he puts it, as you will have noted, piously agnostic. Now, somewhat later, he says, and this is on page 140, he invokes Abraham Joshua Heschel. Like Heschel, I feel I must leave it to others to speculate about creation, not because I share his certainties about the reliability and sufficiency of the Torah's account, but because my spiritual certainties arise from my own experience. And who among us has had personal experience of God's creating the heavens and the earth? I understand the force of the question, and certainly if he's referring to the original creation, assuming there was an original creation, it's perfectly understandable. If, however, in the context of worship, he also says, Mechadesh b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh v'reishit, he might want to temper his question somewhat, since presumably every day the creation goes on, and even the processes can be examined and appreciated. How they would have related to the original creation, of course, remains another matter. He goes on, however. Yet, I can emulate Heschel by trying to raise our consciousness of our createdness, and thus bring us to an appreciation of our Creator. In other words, as creation pertains to us, that we are creatures, in some important ways, dependent upon God as Creator, upon the conditions that were established within the universe, that we could live within, flourish within, cope with, etc., and learn from. He's prepared to agree with what Heschel is saying. So our createdness, statement about us more than about God's creation in a direct sense, is important. And this brings us to an appreciation of our Creator. In a word, I am concerned with gratitude. Notice, shift is from what could be a fact dealt with in science as well as in religion, to a focus upon a human virtue, a moral virtue, and also a religious one that is to him of primary interest, even when talking about the creation of the world. He goes on. Our regnant secularity deifies the self. In other words, the secular attitudes and values that dominate our society, that in that sense they are regnant, they deify the self, teaching it to face the world in terms of what it has coming to it. So we take nature and existence for granted, never asking who does the granting. Yet we have no claim on life, reality, or continuity, not even for an instant. But they are there. We cannot give any part of this bounty to ourselves when it is taken from us, and yet, most amazingly, an abundance of goodness is ordinarily handed us. So if the world is conceived of as a creation, regardless of how God might be understood as creator, or or how the process of creation unfolded, or when it unfolded. Thinking of the world and referring to it as creation creates within us something he values highly, and that is why he is committed to continually speak of creation and not challenge it because he does not know anything about the processes, dates, and so on. That, I think, captures the nub of it. If he takes no position on creation as an event, he most certainly does think of creativeness as a part of an ongoing process that is both moral value and pedagogic value in everyone's life, at least in principle. He's somewhat agnostic also about God's relationship to nature. And you can read about this on page 148. He is not agnostic, however, about God's relationship to history. He comments on the issue of reward and punishment. He claims that God imposes a limit upon himself, whereby there is justice, but it is rough justice. In other words, it doesn't come when one necessarily expects it, wishes for it, or even morally demands it, but it comes, sometimes most unexpectedly. It may not be quite as equivalent or carried out in ways that we would have recognized as the poetic way of punishing, or for that matter, rewarding someone who deserves justice. But nonetheless, his point is rough justice does come. This is taken up in part on page 148, as I indicated, and also on 150 on the top of the page. He says the following: "Rather, I often dimly but really discern God's shaping power, making itself felt, now strongly, now weakly." Weakly here in the W-E-A-K-L-Y sense. Not each week, but not so strongly. And then inexplicably not at all, in the ordinary flow of reality. In other words, there are manifestations of divine justice sometimes in unexpected ways, either strongly or weakly, and other absences of divine justice. He'll factor that in too. Perfections aside, love engenders love, and violence arouses hatred. Wisdom enriches life, and ignorance diminishes it. Notice all of this is natural language, naturalistic language. Even amid the brutal power realities we call history, the trampled human spirit has survived and even triumphed. Should a generation that has seen Nazism defeated and the communist empire collapse from within deny that God has given goodness its own power? Having forced myself at least to break the silence with these words, I find my mind and imagination inadequate to saying the more that my heart tells me is true. In other words, what his heart tells him is ultimately what is persuasive, but in articulating it through using his mind or using his imagination to choose the right words that would be moving and capture our attention and even our devotion and acceptance, that he's admitting he has less ability to do. So in his heart, he knows that God is at work in history. And in that regard, he has a certain similarity with Fackenheim, who speaks of God's return to history even when God appears to be absent. Fackenheim says there is a 614th commandment, for which does not make such a claim. But the point is, God is involved in history, but not in ways that are always so easily recognized. To give one anticipation of this, in biblical literature at least, there is a metaphor that is used for God in the book of Isaiah, first Isaiah. I think it is chapter 8, where God is referred to by the expression of, or the reference to a part of Jerusalem you may have seen and actually had some intimate experience with, namely the waters of the Gihon Spring as they flow through the Siloam Tunnel all the way to the pool of Siloam. This is outside the walls of the old city, in what is close to the city of David. And if you have walked through the Siloam Tunnel, it was the causeway that brought water into the ancient city of Jerusalem. It was carved out roughly around 701 BCE during the period when the Assyrians were threatening to surround and attack Jerusalem. So the king at the time, and I believe it was Hezekiah, saw to it that water supply would be not outside the gates of Jerusalem, but inside the gates and inside the walls. This tunnel was dug. And the waters are described this way: Mei hashiloach haholchim le'at. The translation often given is the waters of Siloam or Shiloach, which flow gently. The more literal translation, and I think relevant for our purpose here, is the waters of Shiloach, meaning God's activity, which flows on slowly, and therefore in many ways unrecognizably until the results come in and cannot be avoided. And he gives a contrasting view of waters that build up, and when they build up to a sufficient point, they can crash through any barrier and drown anyone and everyone on the other side. And that will be the fate, it seems, of the Assyrians and others who truly try and destroy God's place in the city of Jerusalem. So that gives at least some bearing to what Dr. Borowitz is saying. To carry this just a little bit further, on page 152, he goes further to claim that God's hand shapes human history as much as man's does. He gives a number of easy examples. Whether he can deal with more difficult ones is another problem. Let's see what he says. It's on 152, paragraph 2. I see we are out of time for at least today's session, so I will pick this up when we convene again, which for me will be tomorrow morning. And for you, whenever you are able to tune in and capture this material and apply it and use it for your own purposes. Thank you very much. I'll be in touch again with you tomorrow morning, and we'll continue on page 152 of Renewing the Covenant.